Today we're going to be looking at Jesus' metaphor of the vine and the branches as it's found in John chapter 15, verses 1 to 8. And I've entitled my talk, Fruitful Connections. It was a sober day in my life as a teenager when I had to stand before a judge. I had been charged with a traffic offense while riding my motorcycle, and I was required to appear in court. In one of those penetrating ironies of life, the judge before whom I stood had a few years previously been my beloved Little League baseball coach. You will have no trouble believing me when I tell you that I related to him very differently as a judge than I had as my coach. Just as we talked about last week, the way in which we relate to people is hugely dependent on how we know them. And once again, the scripture reading used in many churches throughout the world this Sunday invites us to examine how we relate to God. John 15, 1 to 8 is especially appropriate at this time of year because it talks about vines and fruit which remind us of spring. Every year, trees and plants which have appeared dead during the long winter come alive during the spring. And in response to that promise of fresh life, many of you become a George. George is not only a good royal name, but Georges are also the people who plant and cultivate with the anticipation of harvesting the fruit of their care. George is another one of those words which has been directly lifted out of the ancient Greek in which the New Testament was written, and it simply meant farmer or gardener as it is used in today's scripture. In the Greek, it's pronounced something like this. I'm no guarantees here, but Yorgos. And you can hear the kind of the letters there. And for myself, one of the coolest parts of our scripture reading for today is that it tells us that God is a George. Here's a question to keep in mind as we read this section of scripture. Does viewing God as a gardener or as a farmer, does it fit with how I relate to God? After all, viewing God as a gardener/farmer is very different from viewing God as a demanding military officer or as a stern judge. In addition to God being identified as a George, a gardener, Jesus gave himself a unique identity in the scripture. So previously, Jesus had said, I am the bread, I am the light of the world, I am the gate, and I am the good shepherd. And now, in the last of those I am identifiers, Jesus said, I am the vine. Bread, light, gates, shepherds, and vines, they're all very different from one another, but they are all metaphors intended to help us know God through knowing Jesus. And so reflect on the words here of John 15, verses 1 to 8, where Jesus said, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener, the Yorgos, the George. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. Just a word on the side, the word for prune and the word for clean are the same word. Jesus went on to say, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Now, a grapevine was a common metaphor in the Bible for measuring the prosperity of the Jewish nation. When God was displeased with his people, Israel was described as a vine that produced bad grapes, and you can find that in Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. When God was pleased with his people, the vine was a symbol of peace and prosperity. And for instance, 1 Kings 3:25 tells us that during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, lived in safety, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree. Much later, Jesus told the parable of the tenants, in which a vineyard represented the world, and you can find that in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 21. In that parable, the tenants of the vineyard killed the heir to the vineyard so as not to lose control of it. It didn't take a clever person to understand that the point of the parable of the vineyard and the tenants was that Jesus was a threat to the religious systems which controlled people's lives, and that threat would ultimately lead to his execution. In the particular teaching we look at in John 15, Jesus put a unique spin on the vine as a metaphor. Instead of using the vine as a symbol of a disobedient nation or of economic prosperity, Jesus used the vine as a metaphor for evaluating our relational health. As one whose roots are in a farming community, I love the imagery of God as a farmer. The vine as a metaphor for relational health makes perfect sense if we view God as a George, as a gardener or farmer. It gives me a warm feeling to view God as a farmer because there is no farmer or gardener in the world who has a goal of growing poor crops. If God is a farmer or gardener, it means that God's intention for us is always to thrive. Usually, if we think of growing a crop, we concern ourselves with soil conditions, with weather, with water, and with fertilizer. And even though those kinds of elements were central to Jesus' own parable of the sower, they were not the core of Jesus' message in the metaphor of the vine. Rather, Jesus' point was that a productive branch must be connected to a healthy, nutrient-rich vine, which will provide life for the branch. We could assume that anything connected to a well-rooted and established vine should itself be able to thrive, but that was not necessarily the case because the health of the branches in the metaphor was determined by their fruit. Farmers are not nearly as concerned about the appearance of their crops as they are about their production. I've heard stories of farmers being disappointed at harvest because the crop looked beautiful, but the production was low. And I've heard stories of the crop having a poor appearance prior to harvest, but the production ended up being surprisingly high. God, as a farmer or gardener, is much less concerned about our appearance and much more concerned about the fruit we produce. As Jesus famously said, by their fruits you will know them. That's in Matthew chapter 7. And one of the key elements of faith that is far too often overlooked is that God is less interested in our ability to interpret theology and more interested in the fruit of our mutual relationship. Our fruit is the practical result that following Jesus makes on our lives. Something that is often overlooked is that God is not theoretical, God is practical. That's why the Bible talks a lot about fruit bearing. The well-known words of Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 to 23 offer this important summary. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. According to this list of fruit, God looks for the very same thing in relationships that we look for in relationships with people, because the identical fruit which evidences a healthy relationship with God will also promote healthy relational connections to people around us. The fruit that God as a farmer wishes to produce in us is exactly what we all need if we are going to enjoy productive relationships with people. Identifying God as a farmer slash gardener means that God looks for practical outcomes. According to the metaphor of the vine and the branches, the biggest threat to producing relationship building fruit is a poor connection to the source. That's why Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Relationships don't typically suffer heart attacks and die sudden deaths. Instead, it's the corrosive elements which creep in over time and which begin to loosen the strength of our relational connections. Bit by bit, the branch loses its connection to the vine and eventually discovers it is no longer producing fruit. Small issues, unattended, break important connections, leaving us devoid of relationship building fruit. COVID has caused us to live in a time when we can easily feel as if our relational connections are being severed. Our inclination is to assume that physical separation produces relational separation, but that's not necessarily true. It's not without reason we have the old saying, absence makes the heart grow fonder. In my own experience, for example, being separated by great distance only served to deepen the relationship I had with my own parents. We shouldn't assume that social distancing will damage our relationships as long as we continue to develop relationship building fruit in our lives. When it comes to church life, COVID has forced all churches to seriously consider what church will be like after social distancing restrictions are lifted. For good or for bad, COVID restrictions have surfaced issues that previously lay dormant. There's a general consensus among church leaders that church life will be different, but nobody knows exactly how different. Looking at our experience with COVID restrictions through the lens of Jesus' metaphor of the vine and the branches raises an important question. Is there more to following Jesus than going to church on Sunday? And the answer is that, of course, there is. The goal of following Jesus is to produce fruit. Going to church on Sunday is a celebration of the connection we all share with the vine. But simply going to church on Sunday is no guarantee that our lives will exhibit the fruit that God purposes to produce. We could even go as far as to say that a church service is an unlikely place to test the development of that fruit. The fruits of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are more likely to be observed outside a church service than in one. In fact, it's the frustrations and challenges of life that the production or lack of production of spiritual fruit will be the most visible. Truthfully, social distancing regulations have more to do with exposing the state of our own spiritual fruit than they do with impeding the growth of that fruit. With that in mind, COVID restrictions become a call for all of us to evaluate our personal connection to the vine, which is Jesus Christ.